And here we go with Livy, Book 1, Chapter 14. Post. This is something that's going to take an accusative. Aliquot. It means something, as you can see from the quot. Quot. It's going to do with numbers. So after some years, or after a few years, several years. The propinqui. These are the nominative plural for relatives. Propinqui. Of Regus and of Tatius, so these are the double genitives. So the relatives of King Tatius. Now we have objects in the accusative. The legatos, the delegates or the embassy of the Laurentium. This is a genitive. Pulsant, they beat him. So after some years, as that took the accusative, these relatives beat the delegates or the embassy. Cumqui, and when Laurentes, these are people, Ure Gentium, using by the law of the races, this is like a universal law of all the races, that's the ablative, Agarant, so they were just conducting a lawsuit, but by the law of all the races. Apud, which is amongst Tatius, so we'll have to see what goes on after this. Gratia, which is favour or grace and influence. Suorum. Okay, so amongst Tardiums, Suorum of his people, there was Gratia and Preces plus Poterant. So his influence of his people, his Suorum, they were plus more. Poterant just means they're able. So by the influences and the entreaties or prayers of his own people, there was more. The law was more in Tardius's favour. So igator, therefore, illorum of them, poenem, the punishment, in se, unto them, vertit. So therefore he turned their punishment on them. Nam, for Lavini, this is a locative, so this was taking place at Lavinium. Cum ad solemne sacrificium, so when to a solemn sacrifice, solemne again has the E there, so sacrificium you would gather would be neuter. Venisset, so when he had come, this is again Tatius. So eo there, so when he had come there at Lavinius and for this solemn sacrifice, concursu facto, this is ablative absolute, and in interficitor, so he was killed by a concourse, a coming together. In fact, that just means it was done. So a group came together and they killed him. And we'll have a daily dictionary word of the fourth declension, concursus, a crowd assembly, running to and fro, together, collision, charge, attack, or tumult. Top 2,000 words. Okay, so em ram, this is accusative female. So this matter, minus agri, which means less difficulty, or I don't think it's using the word of sickness, so with less difficulty, quam dignum erat, then was worth it. Romulum, Tulisi. So Romulus bore this with less difficulty than it was worth. Ferunt, so they related, or they that's what they say, or it's recorded as. Siu, this is take a few words usually. It's an or word. Ob, because of. Infidem, which is untrustworthiness, basically. Societatem regni. Because there's little trust in any society, I mean any alliance of ruling a kingdom, basically. Siu again, or queer, because hord inuria casum credibat. So this would be Romulus did not believe, that's what the horde is, that's a negatory word. He didn't believe that the casum, this slaughter, this murder, was in unjust. Itaque bello quidem abstinuit. So itaque means and so, or and so accordingly. Quidem just means indeed or even. So anyway, and indeed he abstained from war, or he did not go to war. Ut, so that, tamen, nevertheless, ut, so that, expiarentur, so it could be expiated, so that, if you know what that means in English, it means the same thing in Latin. So this inurias, these injuries or insults, legatorum of the ambassadors, and we have the qui, meaning we continue on with an and the cades regus, and the killing of the king could be expiated, or there could be a follow-up to it. A foedus, which is a treaty. Inter Romam, inter It's a preposition that takes the accusative. So Romem and Lavinium, the Urbes, which are cities, was renovated. It was renewed. Or that's how that sentence went. Et cum. And when his, these things, quidem even were an inspirata pax erat. So there was an unhoped for pax. Basically, it just means unexpected. So that's how that concluded. And aliud, another, multo proprius. Proprius is a comparative. So a much closer, at qui and, in ipsis, in itself, prope, near, portus, the gates, bellum autumn. So another much closer, bellum, which is a war, autumn arose, and this itself, actually that's a plural, these in themselves were almost at the gates. The fidenates, these are people, you can tell from it's a proper noun, even though it's starting a sentence with a capital. Nimbus, which means too much. Vicinus, it's in the vicinity, so these are the neighbours. So there was too much in the neighbours, prope, say, near themselves. So con valescere opes rate. So the rate goes with the fidenates. They were thinking, it's the plural form of it. So the fidenates were thinking that prope, near themselves, there was a neighbour that was too much in opes, too much resources and wealth. Con valescere, which means valescere means growing strong. And priusquam, which means in prior then, tantum roboris esset quantum. Tantum and quantum are correlatives. So, and prior to them being so strong is basically what it's saying. Quantum as it apparabat futurum. So, prior to them getting strong as it appeared that they would in future, they occupant. Basically they did this in advance. It's a few different translations of occupant, but the best ones, since there's a facere here, they decided to anticipate and to make a bellum, to make war. Juventut arma in missa vastatur. So we have three ablatives. So in missa means they were sent in, and it's female. So these are juventuts. This means young men. It's actually considered female in Latin. And armata means they're armed. So having sent in armed young men, vastatur, they devastated or ravished the agri, which would be the nominative, so which are the fields, quod which inter urbem and the fidens est. So all the fields which were between the city and these people, these young armed men were sent in and they devastated it. So they're taking action preeminently. So they've sent in the young armed men to devastate land. Inde then ad lavum, which is to the left, versi, again it's plural, so they were turned to the left, quia, because, dextra, it's an adverb. To the right, Tiberius arcabat. This means they were warded off by the Tiber River, basically. To the right was the Tiber River arcabat, which is blocking them, basically. Cum magna trepidation, so with a great trepidation, so there was worries. Agrestium, this is a genitive plural, of the agrestes, of the rural people, of the farmers and such. And populantur, again, this is continuing on with the vastatur, they are ravaging the place. And the tumultus repens ex agris in urbem in latus. Okay, so this tumult and disturbances, repens was suddenly from the fields, the agris, into the city, in with the accusative, in latus, it was brought in. And so this tumultus in latus, suddenly from the countryside into the city, pro nuntio fuit, through messages basically. Excitus Romulus, so Romulus with a past passive in apposition here, so he was roused or excited. And anim 4, neither a dilationem, which is a postponement or any wasting of time. Patai looks like a passive. Tam vicinium bellum poterat, here's our verb. So Romulus being excited because he couldn't afford to postpone anything. Poterat, he was able, or he's not able to suffer or endure any postponement with a bellum, war, tam vicinium, so close to them. And so he educated, he led out his exercitum in the accusative. He led out his army and a castra, which is a camp, a fidelis mille passum locat. So he located his castra, he placed his camp a milli passum, which is a mile from the Fidenes. Okay, ibi. So there, that's the adverb. Modico praesidio relicto. This is ablative absolute. So he left. He relicted a modico, a modest praesidio, a garrison. This is in this place, the camp, which is a mile away. He placed a modest garrison, and he aggressed. He came out, past passive, with omnibus corpus, with all his forces. A partem militum, which is part of his military or a party of his soldiers. Locus circa densa obsita virgulta obscurus subsidere in insidias uset. And here, so he's ordered this part of his soldiers in insidious, means in ambushes, subsidere to settle down, circa around, dense obsita virgulta. This is like dense thickets and bushes, which are obscurus. So they're in hiding with obsita. So if you just put all that together, make some English translation. So he left the modest garrison there, left with all of his army. Part of them he ordered to be settled down into some ambushes around some dense scrub, basically. Okay, cum parte maiore, which means with the major part and omni equitato and all his cavalry, profectus he set out. Back here with obsita, that's a adjective, it just means overgrown as well. And id quod querabat, it is neuter, and quod is the relative neuter. This thing which querabat he was wanting, tumultuoso and minasi genere pugne. So this is in a disturbed fashion and threatening genere type of pugne battle. He ad equitando, this is a gerund. Equito comes from horse, so he's rode his horse ad up to ipsis prope portis. Up to the propes again means near, so the port itself, which is the gates, is what it really means because it's female. So he was disorganised and conducting himself in a threatening way. He rode right up to the ports itself and he excitated the hostem, and he stirred up the enemy. Fuga quoqui, which means flight also. Que which simulanda erat. This is a periphrastic gerund which had to be pretended or feigned or simulated. So the flight which had to be simulated. Eadam equestris is the cavalry. Pugna eadam, which is the same fight. Causam for the reason of the fight. Minus mirabilem dedit, which was less to be amazed at. Et cum, and when velut as if interpugne fugaque, so as if amongst the fighting and the fleeing, a concilium trepidante equata. So there was a plan here, a concilium, and with the equitated, with the cavalry in trepidation, velut as if whether they should fight or flee. Remember, they're trying to draw them out by this simulanda, this pretense. The peds quoqui, so the pedestrians, the infantry, foot soldiers, also they referrated their gradum. They took back their steps, so they went in retro, they went backwards. Planus repente portus, effusi hostes. So repente, suddenly, the ports, the gates were planus, full of hostes, enemy, effusing out, or flowing out in an impulsa. So these hostes is doing the impulsor. So they've come forwards in an attack on the Romana Accies, on the Roman battle lines or column or however you want to call that. Studio. There was zeal in stande and sequende. So in standi is of, there was a zeal of pressing forwards and sequendi and of following. And they were tre hunted, as you can see that's passive and it's got the nt there, so it's plural. They were drawn ad locum to the place insidiarum of the ambush. Indi subito, so then suddenly, exhortai Romani, the Romans, plural nominative, they exhorted, they rose up, that's what that basically means. Transversam, something in the accusative going sideways, invaded. So this is what they're doing. The Romans rose up invading, which means they were pressing the battle from this ambush, and the hostium of the enemy aciem. So transversam and aciem are accusatives. Transverse means that they invaded them, crossing over their flank. They went to the transverse. They went side on through the battle line of the enemy. And we're nearly done. Adunt pavorem, and they added a pavor, which is a fear. Motor e castra signa, signa and motor in apposition. So they added fear with in the ablative, the standards, the signas had been moved e castras from the camp, eom of them, qui who in presidio relicti fuerunt. So those who had been relicti, those who had been left in the garrison in presidio, they were now adding to the fear because they had moved out from that camp with all their standards. Ita, thus or so, multiplici terror, with these manifold terror, it's a ablative singular, so with manifold terror anyway, perculsi fidinate, so the finates were struck, perculsid, and prius pane, which is before pane almost, quam Romulus, and which Romulus, qui, and clitic means and, qui, those who. Before that, when Romulus and those who, avihi cum air, and those who were being carried with him, or I guess they carried on horses, visi rent, before they were seen. So almost before Romulus and those who were with him, being carried on horses, were seen, and circum agorant. Agorant means just controlling, circum means around. Frenus equos, that's the Frenus is the reins and equos is horse. So almost before they could circumagorate the reins with their horses, vertunt, they turned their turgo, they turned backs, almost before they'd even visirent, before they'd seen Romulus. Multo qui effusia, so there was much effusion, much running off, much flight. Quippy, sense, vera fuga, this was a true flight, qui, those who were simulanting, those who were pretending, paulo ante, a little before, secuti erant, being followed. So here we have, this was a true flight because those who a little before had been simulating secuti being followed, they repetibanted the oppidum. They were re-seeking, the imperfect, the oppidum, the town. So we're just about done. Non tamen, so nevertheless tamen, non iripue se hosti. And so hosti is the enemy, were not able to iripure se themselves reflective, so they couldn't snatch themselves out of the way basically, so they couldn't get away. Here ends, this is the present participle, in tergo, on the backs, Romanos. Romanus is the Romans, but it's singular here, like with a multitudo, which it's written as a singular, but it'd be the Romans in plural. The Romans were sticking their hands on their back, priusquam, before the fores portarum obicurantur. Fores is the gates outside, and the ports are the gates as well. So before the outside gates could be closed, before the gates of the gateways could be closed, velut, as if uno agmon, in one column, inrompet. So the Romans inrumpeted. They burst in before the gates could be closed, as if in one battle line.